everybody. I'm Anna Palmer, CEO and one of the founders of Punchbowl News. We want to thank you all for joining us in person and for those of you who are joining us on the live stream to kick off this series, Investing in Tomorrow Today. In partnership with Apollo Global Management, we are thrilled to have Representative Patrick McHenry, the Republican from North Carolina, who recently made the announcement that he's going to be staying on as the top Republican of the House Financial Services Committee. Afterwards, we are going to have Mark Rowan, CEO and one of the co-founders of Apollo, join me for a fireside chat. Just a quick reminder to everyone here and everybody watching at home that you can tweet about this, follow us on all social media channels at Punchbowl News. And with that, let's welcome Mr. McHenry to the stage. All right. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, thanks.
You're good?
We got no shortage of things to discuss here this morning, so we'll keep you on the hot seat for a little bit. But you got the news out of the bag a little bit before this conversation, which is you've made the decision to stay on at the House Financial Services Committee and not run for leadership, as a lot of people thought you might. Talk to us about that decision. Why?
Yeah, well, Punchbowl broke it. Thank you, or damn you. I'm not sure. No, the decision I made my second term in Congress was there are two jobs in the place that I desired. One was to be whip, the other was to chair financial services. And I'm presented with the option, and because I believe Republicans will get the majority in the House, and that's what I'm working for, but presented with the option of which one do you want in the circumstance we're in. I know what the next Congress looks like in terms of legislating. It's going to be mainly an oversight function for the House of Representatives in a divided Washington. There are a few narrow opportunities for legislating, but outside of those narrow opportunities for legislating and oversight, we have two big votes. One is funding the government, and the other is raising the debt ceiling. So I realize being the whip, counting votes for those two big votes, those two big initiatives, versus running an agenda on the Financial Services Committee. And I've had the opportunity to sit next to the ranking member, as ranking member, sit next to the chairman, and the chair makes the decisions on the agenda. You're basically riding shotgun, and yet you don't have any control over where you're going. And so I'd like the opportunity to run an agenda, and I'm optimistic about the opportunities that we have around innovation, capital formation, and oversight that make it very interesting to be on the Financial Services Committee and to run the agenda of the committee. So given the circumstance, I'm much more optimistic about the opportunities we have at Financial Services than the role that I could play in House Republican leadership.
So I want to talk about your priorities and what you're kind of looking forward in terms of your vision. But before that, are you saying never to whip or just not right now?
Not right now. Never to leader. I'm not saying never to leadership, but right now the choice between whip versus chair of the Financial Services Committee, chairing the committee is much more interesting to me.
There's a bunch of other of your colleagues who are in the mix now that you have stepped aside. Lee Stefanik, Jim Banks, Tom Emmer. Who do you want to be the whip?
They're all great options.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go. No, actually, in talking to some of them, they were very interested in my views on them. When but this is
now you get to be like the wise, legislator.
But here's the whole thing about politicians is politicians are self-centered. But enough about them. Let's talk about me. All right. So everybody wanted to have that conversation. I'm like, let me just get this out of the way, and I wanted to make sure that House Republicans and these candidates running get to know who they get to choose for leadership. And we got great options. That's a beautiful thing in this. So yes, there are people that are a little excited that could possibly be whip, and some people that are disappointed on committee, but that's just the nature of a decision like this.
Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, are they the next speaker and majority leader should Republicans take the election?
Yes.
All right, full stop. Let's move on to your agenda here. You talked about all kinds of things, innovation, tech policy, digital assets. I want to talk about innovation to start. What have you seen during the pandemic with federal agencies that you want to make permanent, right? COVID has made people have to kind of pivot in a way, particularly in government, which you don't see them often do.
So what we've seen in 2 years' time is a generation of technology deployment in the federal sphere. You see this from local governments to state governments to the federal government, who are going from paper to digitization. And it took COVID to force those decisions. Closing a mortgage today versus 5 years ago, it's a very different circumstance. Closing loan documents, different circumstance. So what we have to do is make permanent those temporary changes across agencies, and the agencies that have been lagging, like the IRS, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, they need to catch up. We're also seeing examinations for financial institutions during COVID looked different, and they recognized at the FDIC, for instance, that you didn't have to have people sitting in a bank to look at the same data that they can look on a screen from anywhere in the world. So I think those shifts and changes, we have to go agency by agency to ensure that we're driving that tech deployment that occurred as a begrudging fact during COVID and make it permanent.
Let's talk about data privacy. It's something that the Financial Services Committee has not tackled in decades. Obviously, there's been a lot of change in terms of how we bank, how we do everything online. What are your plans there?
So data privacy, we have a separate set of regulations around financial firms, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley standard that was written into law in 1998. We have the most restrictive data standards within the financial sphere compared to the rest of the economy. So hospitals can do more with your healthcare data than a bank can do with your financial data. What we have to do is update the technology standards around data privacy for financial firms. And we have to ensure that furnishers that are furnishing data here adhere to the same standards that the regulated sphere has to adhere to. And so those changes, we can actually have a bipartisan approach to these changes that is distinct and separate from the conversation other committees are having around big tech and the use of data across the rest of the economy. I'm much more optimistic about our ability to get a bipartisan result on data privacy for the financial world than I am across the rest of the sphere.
Do you take a pass on the big tech kind of questions on, that are facing Congress?
I don't take a pass. I think we have to have a smart approach rather than a clunky approach. I'll give you a great example. What is happening with algorithms, shadow bans, and people being deplatformed on Twitter? Well, as Congress has been discussing this over the last 5 years and trying to figure out how to regulate Twitter and social media, shareholders have actually taken action. So Elon Musk got a deal together within 2 weeks to take over Twitter. Congress has not been able to do a damn thing in the last 2 weeks. So the idea that we're going to have government regulation of social media, of big tech, that limits their ability to actually grow and take what is an American technology, American ethos around rule of law and freedom of speech globally, we should not be in the business of curbing those opportunities for our technology companies to go global and to take our standards and push them across the globe and to embrace them across the globe. So I've got a different view than I think many people do, especially in the current debate on big tech.
That's super interesting. You mentioned oversight. Obviously, that is going to be the big key for Republicans post-midterms, particularly if you take the majority in the House, as everybody expects. Talk about the SEC and CFPB. What areas are ripe for Republicans to dig into in a majority?
Well, so the CFPB is in the same traditional position it's been in Democrat administrations, which is a director of the agency who thinks that he is a state attorney general, the U.S. Attorney General, the Department of Justice, embodied in himself, which is not the role of the agency. And is not the role of traditional financial regulation. We have to balance a number of different factors around safety and soundness of institutions and ensuring consumers are protected in a way that other areas of the economy don't have to have a different set of functions. So CFPB is now back to where it was at the end of the Obama administration, an out-of-touch agency that is out of control. So we're going to have a concerted effort around oversight of the actions of the CFPB that are beyond the confines of the law that they're pursuing. That's one. Two, when we go to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler has a very aggressive agenda that is not traditional for the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is not traditional because the way we regulate markets is a question of materiality around disclosures. With the latest climate disclosure regime that he's put in place, it doesn't confine itself to the rules and the regulations that the Securities and Exchange Commission must abide by. That's just one. Two, he's very interested in changing the full market structure of how we raise capital and deploy capital here in the United States. He has a lot of thoughts that are quite reasonable and others that are quite destructive. And we need to make sure that we understand fully the consequences of the decisions that he is attempting to make. But I recognize that elections have consequences. And the president has the authority to make appointments, and over time, they can get the policy they want. What we have to ensure, though, is that laws are adhered to, due process is given, the due consideration is given to alternative sets of ideas, and those consequences are well known by the public. That oversight function is us ensuring the public knows the consequences of these bad decisions.
Some of your colleagues have already invoked the Congressional Review Act as one of the ways that they can kind of pull back or push back against this administration, particularly when it comes to some of these SEC proposed rulemakings. How is that going to play out? Is that something that you think is one of the tools in the toolbox?
Sure, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. In the right circumstance, you can be successful with the Congressional Review Act. 2017 was a banner year for the Congressional Review Act. It was the year of the Congressional Review Act when we had more than a dozen major rulemakings of the Obama administration repealed in the first year of Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican in the White House. We're not going to be in that circumstance after the next election. The hope is that Republicans control the House and the Senate, but the Senate is a quirky beast. And even with a majority in the Senate, the party doesn't get to fully control the outcomes. Right. And we're going to have a Democrat in the White House next Congress. So in order to get a successful implementation of a Congressional Review Act, you have to ensure that it gets signed into law. It's very difficult to get this president to sign in law the very policies he put in place and his people put in place. So I think we have to be thoughtful about how we use that, be strategic about how we use that, and understand the likely outcome of that. It's not likely you're going to get a Democrat to repeal Democrat policies.
I think that's fair to say. Yes, I agree with you. I put money on that,
Yeah.
that angle.
Injecting a bit of reality is, again, like a little bit of the, I feel like it's a little bit of my job here.
I appreciate that. I want to talk about crypto. Let's start with this. How do you define a stable coin, and do you feel like the government is on the same page with the private sector?
Largely on the same page. Hill Democrats and Republicans are in largely the same position around the key architecture of a payment stable coin. A payment stable coin is, first to level set with everybody, it is your on-ramp to digital assets. It is your ability to take what is your dollar and put it in digital form, right? We think of that commonly as we look at our bank account online and we think that's digital. It's not quite that way. So what that does is enable you to get into the world of other digital assets. So namely, Bitcoin, right? Yep. So in order to purchase Bitcoin, you have to take your US dollar and turn it into some digital asset in order to purchase Bitcoin. That's a step of the process.
Right.
So that piece called a stable coin, which is taking a US dollar and making it basically a digital US dollar. We don't have a regulatory regime around it. There is no federal regulatory regime around stable coins. We have two states that have ideas on this, New York being the leader in the world of digital assets, and they have a regulatory regime around digital assets. And so we're allowing New York to determine what is US dollar in a digital realm. That's not smart policy. And Hill Democrats and Republicans agree there. So the key elements where we have agreement. One-to-one backing. So that means that your one digital US dollar has either cash backing it up or high-quality liquid assets, which means treasuries, a very limited range of things, right? The things that will be about 100% of what it is today, tomorrow, sure, and into the future. and that they have the full faith and credit of the U.S. government backing it up. One-to-one backing, narrow range of assets, and 3, a larger array of folks than just banks are able to issue it. 4th and finally, federally regulated. And so those are the 4 key pieces, and we have agreement on those things. I'm optimistic we can get that first step of legislating around digital assets done over the next year or so.
The Biden administration has said they want stablecoins to only be issued by the insurance depository institutions in the U.S. Treasury's report on stablecoins. You oppose that idea. How far are you from where the Biden administration is? How far is the hill from where the Biden administration is on
About 20% off. In the realm of Washington today, that is pretty damn close, right? So what they're saying is stablecoins are so risky, digital assets are so risky, that we should make them a part of the banks that blew up in 2008, which is counter to what Democrats have said for the last 15 years in Washington. We're supposed to de-risk these institutions that could go back to the federal taxpayer and ask for a bailout. And I agree, we should actually de-risk these institutions. To have them in the world of digital assets, like issuing stablecoins, I don't think is the answer. I think what we should have is a regime that has a special charter around what is a stablecoin, and we regulate that very simply, very clearly, and you have a very low level of risk around that asset. And frankly, that's where my Democrat colleagues are. Some actually are much more expansive in this view of what they want stablecoins to do. I think we should have a very narrow view of this, very smart regulatory sphere, and allow the innovation to occur thereafter.
So it sounds like you're saying you think there needs to be a new regulatory regime to actually regulate it, not one of the current institutions.
Right. Yes.
With that.
So on stablecoins, I think you can give it to an existing regulator in Washington. Around digital assets, we have a bigger debate. So that first step of our debate around cryptocurrency and digital assets begins with stablecoins. I think that's sort of the entry point for all this stuff because it's a narrow range of issues you deal with. When it comes to digital assets, I think what we've had is what we've heard from the industry is some want the CFTC to regulate them, and they want digital assets to be considered a commodity. And you have others that say, please, dear God, don't let the Securities and Exchange Commission near me. But the Securities and Exchange Commission will be near you because if you're in the capital markets and you pass the Howey test, which means you're a security, they're going to find you. You can't wishfully hope that the law enforcement won't find you when you're breaking the law, right? So what I think we have to do is first define what is a digital asset in federal law. We currently don't do that. There's a clunky way under the infrastructure bill that they attempted to do that, but that's not in keeping with any sort of element of thoughtful legislating. So what we have to do is define what is a digital asset. And what I believe is a digital asset is neither fish nor fowl. It is neither a commodity nor a security. Bitcoin is the best embodiment of that. I think you have to have a separate regulatory sphere for digital assets that is neither the SEC nor the CFTC. And it's Congress's role that we have to define a digital asset because there is no federal definition now, number one. And number two, we have to give it a regulator or a home. And that is Congress's job and role here. And I fundamentally think that the Securities Exchange Commission and the CFTC lack that capacity to well regulate this new innovation.
That's news, folks. Thank you. Breaking news here at Punchbowl News. I want to talk about cryptocurrency a little bit.
For the world of crypto, that's news, I think.
I mean, come on. Yeah. I want to talk about, though, because some people say the jury's out on crypto, right? Yeah. What are the challenges that you think cryptocurrency can solve?
The cost of payments, the movement of money. We pay more for the movement of money than any other country on the globe. And so transaction costs are very high. Global remittances are stubbornly high. So for the world's migrants who send money home, it is a stubbornly high cost to move money. Cryptocurrency digital assets can be a solution to that. number one. Number two, it can provide greater information, greater clarity around contracts and contract law, traditional sort of mindset there. And over time, I think it will fundamentally change the commodities market and the securities market, because we'll have new ways of having disclosures that have been lagging and clunky under existing Securities and Exchange Commission regime and a CFTC regime. That is a great opportunity for investor clarity, investor information, and the ability to raise capital in those traditional settings. But we also have new innovations here that are trying to solve complicated problems. Smart contracts, the art market of NFTs, those people that have artist rights connected with their creativity. There are new inventions here that are much like where the internet was in 1992 or 1993. You couldn't have contemplated that a car would pick you up because you had an AOL account, right? And yet that was one of the innovations that came along a decade and a half later. So that we're at this very entry level spot with Web3, with digital assets. I'm quite optimistic that they're going to have great solutions. I also think that there are some in this realm that fall into traditional securities regulation, traditional commodities regulation. But there's new innovation in that space, and that's what we have to embrace.
We are quickly running out of time, but I have a couple questions left for you. One on capital formation. We were talking about this up in the green room. One of the frustrations in the investment community is the accredited investor standard. For anybody of those who are unfamiliar, I was until we started a company ourselves a year and change ago. But the accredited investors have to have more than $200,000 in income or $300,000 combined with a spouse for the last 2 years. Or, in other words, a net worth of more than $1 million. This is supposed to basically protect against less sophisticated investors from risky investments, but it also prevents a lot of people from actually being able to invest in things.
Well, I mean, so for small business formation, if you're born on the wrong side of the tracks without connections, this is a severe limiter to start up a business. The accredited investor standard takes out people that are highly informed or connected in a way that doesn't fit neatly with securities law. We have to update the standard, and it has to be in keeping with the current market needs and the current disclosure needs. Investors are smarter today than they've ever been before, and yet we have a more limited number of public options for them to participate in. And as a result of that, you're seeing great fluctuation, like we saw with meme stocks a year ago. You're seeing greater fluctuations around people in this marketplace that want upside potential, and they know that they could lose it all. Sure. And so they're taking smart risks. But to me, the solution, the thing that we're trying to solve for is the creation of new small businesses. You and your co-founders started this, and you had to go raise money, and you understand this great limitation around people that you know that are in your social network that couldn't participate because of these standards, that want to be a part of what you're doing and want to help, not for the economic return, but because they believe in you. Sure. That's the connectivity piece that's missing from securities regulation, that we have to update the standard.
All right, two last more political questions. I want to talk about this effort to potentially term limit Democrats, as Kevin McCarthy has said that he is considering. So basically, Democrats don't have the same rules that Republicans do when it comes to how long they can be head of a committee. Do you think that's smart?
It's a terrible idea. Republicans should not be in the business of fixing Democrats' problems. In 1994, when Republicans took over the House of Representatives, we put in place term limits, 3 terms, and that has benefited us because you have had more competition for these spots, and that is term limiting on a committee chairmanship, and we've benefited from that beneficial churn and that creativity that comes as a result of it. And Democrats have had to suffer under their rules. And as a result, you see really smart, talented people run for something else or go somewhere else out of the House. And that's what I've seen over the last 20 years in my service in the House. I don't want to fix their problem. They need to fix their own problem and not leave it to Republicans to fix their bad decisions.
All right, last question. Senator Joe Manchin yesterday suggested that the only way to control inflation is to raise the corporate tax rate to 25 and the capital gains rate to 28. He said this is what Democrats should be focused on in their reconciliation package. Did Republicans cut taxes too low?
No. This is a Democrat response to inflation. And this is the most Democrat response a Democrat could give to inflation, which is, in order to soak up the money supply, they need to raise taxes. No, we have the Federal Reserve. We have monetary policy at the Federal Reserve. They're reining in what they let out in the beginning of COVID, and they're reining in rather quickly. But it's a much more complicated question of inflation, as this administration is experiencing. To be the party in power overseeing inflation is bad news, as my Democrat friends are figuring out. It is even worse when it's their policies that have driven inflation. The overspending of the American Rescue Plan is a direct contributor to the inflation we're feeling today. The extension of unemployment benefits beyond the need is the second driver of this. And it's not me that's saying this. It's the San Francisco Fed had those findings. They're living under a very tough set of economic circumstances that they've foisted upon the American people, and simply raising taxes will not make it better for the American people.
All right. That's the last word. Mr. McHenry, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. Take it. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to bring Mark Rowan up to the stage, CEO and co-founder of Apollo. And I have some fun facts about him as he makes his way up here. He is the asset manager. Apollo is an asset manager with $500 billion under management. But I learned some things about you, Mark. Thank you. Welcome to the stage. Including that you were an early investor in Beats with Jimmy Iovine. You're vice chair and a major backer of DARCA, a network of charter schools for underserved communities in Israel. And recently, you've shared that you're an avid mountain biker.
All true. All true.
All right. Well, I'm glad we're starting on a truthful basis here. I want to just, for the folks here, in Washington, let's start at that 30,000-foot level. For anyone who isn't familiar with Apollo, what is it today? Talk a little bit about where it's going.
So Apollo today is in two businesses. One side of our business is the single largest retirement services company in the country. We've gone from zero in 2008 to about $280 billion today, and all we do is provide retirement services, guaranteed income to pensioners and others. The other side of our business is a traditional asset manager. We call ourselves an alternative asset manager, but for us, an alternative is nothing other than an alternative to publicly traded stocks and bonds, and that's about $500 billion, and the two businesses are very synergistic. Because to provide income to retirees, you need to earn a return. And so the asset manager helps the retirement services company find places to invest and earn a return.
You heard Mr. McHenry talk a lot about private capital and how the administration is taking a more aggressive stance on regulation, whether it's the SEC or other agencies. What's your reaction to how the administration is kind of taking on that regulatory factor?
I think there's not a great understanding in D.C. of how much has changed since 2008. The reality is, in response to the great financial crisis, there were lots of regulatory changes, and by and large, those changes worked. If you look at the economy today, less than 25% of the capital to companies is provided by banks. In Europe, it would be 65%. In Asia, it would be almost 90%. So we have a democratized capital markets, as Representative McHenry said. Pushing risk out of the banking system was one of the things that was a goal of the administrations and various administrations. So where are we today? How do people raise money? Well, the answer is from the investment marketplace. And Representative McHenry also said there are fewer alternatives. There were 8,000 public companies back in 2008. There are now fewer than 6,000 public companies. The reality is the private market is massive. And the private market, people historically have thought of as private equity. All equity has risk. But most of the private market, or I should say private market assets, exist from AA rated all the way to equity. So what's happening right now, I believe, is a regulatory framework that penalizes private because it's perceived as risk, whereas all it is less liquid.
And is that an education campaign that people just haven't maybe been paying attention here in Washington to what's actually been happening in the business sector?
It's partially an education campaign, and it's partially, political motivation. So if you think about, again, the regulatory changes from 2008 forward, people wanted risk pushed out of the banking sector of any place that had a federal guarantee. Well, where did it go? There was no legislation that said where it should go. The answer is that capital formation came to firms like ours and others. And if you look at what happened in the pandemic, the sources of capital were insurance companies, private asset managers, other people who were not dealing with liquid markets. There has been a fundamental change in how public markets operate. Everything is indexed. Everything is traded on liquidity. I know these are terms that are not the everyday terms in DC, but there's really a fundamental change in capital markets.
So interesting. One of the big areas of discussion right now in Washington is energy, particularly in the wake of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. We reported this morning that Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer are considering some sort of energy package to try to give Americans relief at the gas pump. They're really looking ahead to November and the challenges that they have at the ballot box. Apollo is a big investor in the space. What role does and can Apollo play here, if any?
So we have, over the past 3 years, put out $20 billion in energy transition. And most of that money went to support efforts of major businesses to participate in electrification of their gas stations, replacement of coal, replacement of other unclean fuels, solar installations, wind installations. There is nothing but money available for energy transition. This is not just from Apollo. This is everywhere around the globe. What's missing is not incentives. What's missing is not tax credits. What's missing is a clear policy and a clear direction. There's actually a really interesting report out the last week from J.P. Morgan. It's referred to publicly as the least woke report published in the past couple of years. But it basically goes through the science and the availability of transition technologies and concludes that as a country, we need to invest some 1.4 trillion to just maintain where we are. And of that, about half of that is going to need to be invested in hydrocarbons.
Interesting. This series, it's called Investing Today in Tomorrow. You have been a pioneer in the private equity space for a very long time. We spoke with Mr. McHenry about crypto. You recently, I was reading this morning, told David Rubenstein that investors ignoring blockchain are doing it at their own peril. Explain your thinking.
So I thought your conversation with Representative McHenry was actually spot on. It actually took the pieces that are necessary from stablecoin to digital assets. But let's start far afield. Let's start with something crazy, NFTs. Who in the room owns an NFT? Okay. I think if you're under 30, you have a tendency to own NFTs.
It's really our demo here.
So we can laugh at this. But if you think about the technology that is underlying the NFT market to be able to identify a piece of digital art, however crazy with it, I joked with David Rubenstein that has anyone sold a car? You look for something called a piece of paper called a title. Mm-hmm. If you can find it, you sign it and you hand it to someone, and that evidences that you transferred your ownership. Think of how crazy that is. Think of when you buy a house, you have to buy title insurance because you need to ensure that you own the house.
Right.
All of the rails, all of the technology platforms that are being built for these digital assets, however speculative they may be, actually are going to have a really useful life down the road. And I think that's exactly what Representative McHenry was speculating on. As it relates to blockchain, I think about our business. We are a large financial institution. We're $500 billion of assets under management, and we are a massive user of securitization. That's how we finance residential mortgages and commercial mortgages and loans and everything else. That process involves paper. We compile ownership of diverse groups of assets. We put them into a trust. We then issue certificates against a trust. Recently, we took the entirety of that business online and put it on blockchain. It's on a blockchain called Provenance, and we not only get lower costs and better information, but it is instantaneously accessible. And it is how the business is going. And so the updating of our financial infrastructure is happening as we see fit. Stablecoin is a very important part of it, and I think you heard previously that there's a pretty narrow gap, right, and I think a sensible gap Digital assets, the gap is bigger. But I think change is a constant, and blockchain and the tools that surround the updating of the financial infrastructure are absolutely real.
I want to talk about the future of the U.S. market. How does the U.S. stay competitive with the EU and China, Asia in general? What are you most optimistic about when it comes to that?
We as a country have the single best hand of cards to play anywhere in the world. We have a diverse economy, we have intellectual capital, we have rule of law, we have deep capital markets. We can screw it up, but we have just the single best hand to play in energy, technology, healthcare, just keep going down the list. But we also have fundamental challenges. We have lived in a world of inequality. We've also lived in a world of excess. The tail end of your conversation was a little bit about the excess that we're experiencing right now. Anyone who didn't see dumping trillions of dollars into the financial system in a short period of time of constrained supply was going to cause inflation just had to be asleep. We need to rebalance our economy. We need to think about what it is going forward. We are going to run structural deficits of a magnitude that no one can yet appreciate. How do we invest for the future when we're spending all the money taking care of the past? A rejiggering of what we do is not going to be a simple, we raise the corporate rate, we do this. It's going to involve a rethinking of how we approach the whole notion of revenue and benefits. And it's unclear that we're up for that just yet.
I was going to say, I don't think we're quite taking that meta level.
No, I think 22 is not the year.
How concerning is inflation to you?
Concerning, again, our job, we have an easier job than most. Our job is simply to earn excess return per unit of risk. So we take inflation, we take other impediments or other distractions or other forms of negativity in the economy into account when we make investments. One can benefit from inflation, but inflation is everywhere. Do we think inflation will come down? It will. It's already going to come down. I think we'll see it peak relatively soon. The Federal Reserve is shrinking its balance sheet. Liquidity is coming out of markets. Interest rates are going up. Stock wealth is on its way down massively. There's going to be a period of adjustment here. It would not surprise me to see us in recession next year as we overshoot what we're trying to do. But inflation is the predictable consequence of the series of policies we've just come through.
Okay, last question, which is one I often ask folks, which is, you're in Washington, you have the ear, the eyes of lawmakers, their senior staff. What's the one thing that if you could get to them, you would want them to understand?
It's only one thing.
I mean, you're a CEO. It's a top line conversation.
I come at it the other way, which is I do spend a lot of time down here. Our business, when we started 32 years ago, our business was a private equity business. The level of intersection with regulatory and government was very low. Think about our business today. We play a meaningful role in the financial system and in capital formation. And what we do as a firm and what we do in the market, we try to provide context for our role. What I often find in the conversations here, they quickly turn to money. And the thing that I think is poorly appreciated, there's a lot of money out there that's looking for a home to invest. There are massive pools of capital, and what they're looking for is clarity. Regulatory certainty can be much more effective than tax incentives, than money, than special breaks, or anything else, but it's certainly a harder conversation because it requires agreement.
So the kind of planning, the being able to kind of forecast more.
Any form of regulatory certainty would allow capital pools to form behind it. So you seized on energy transition. The notion that a firm like ours, which is relatively small in the landscape of the totality of our financial markets, put $20 billion into energy transition, we'll do another $50 billion over the next 5 years. With regulatory certainty or a regulatory plan, it would be twice that. And multiply what we do by everyone else in the marketplace. Incentives are not needed. Clear rules are needed.
All All right, we will end it there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
I want to thank Mr. McHenry and Apollo Management for making this conversation possible, and all of you for attending and joining us on the live stream. You can find out more about our events at our events hub at punchbowl.news. Have a great day and stay safe, everybody.